one of the best airplane services meals I've ever had was actually in Euro business on Finnair, connecting from France to Helsinki before flying back to the US. And they went all out. I was just expecting crackers. It's a very short flight, glorified economy, but it was actually awesome. I was really impressed.
Hey there, points people! You just heard a clip from Ryan Smith, news managing editor at Upgraded Points, and you can find him on Instagram at Aventura Now. Ryan has been around Points and Miles for several years and has published content at Miles to Memories, Award Wallet, CNBC, USA Today, Blueprint, TripAdvisor, The Points Guy, and Forbes Advisor. And he also holds a Brazilian citizenship and speaks fluent Portuguese. In this episode, expect to hear about when flying in business class probably isn't worth it, either because of a subpar flight experience, pricing that is just way too high, short flight times, or something else. And if you are in the market for a new card to earn points so you can travel like Ryan, check out geobreezetravel.com/cards. And if you're not sure what card is right for you, I offer free credit card consultations at geobreezetravel.com/consultations. And if you're looking for help with how to redeem your points, submit a request for a free personalized tutorial on geobreezetravel.com/request. We pick one of these requests to prepare for free every week and post it in the free GeoBreeze Travel newsletter. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast, a show for anyone wanting to level up their travel hacking lifestyle. I'm your host, Julia Menez. I'm a travel hacker, coach, speaker, Filipino-American ENTJ who loves solid travel gear and using shortcuts on spreadsheets. On this show, I'm on a mission to bring you travel hackers from all walks of life to help you level up your travel hacking game. We dive into credit cards, miles, points, strategy, mindset, and the secrets behind how to travel the world for next to no cost. So, let's get hacking. Hey Ryan, welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm so excited to have you here and to talk about which business class products are not worth the hype and which ones we would actually recommend skipping or trying to find a different way to get over the ocean, if at all possible. And if the listeners are people who want to have a nicer flight experience and don't just want to optimize for cost or find the cheapest business class flight all the time. But before we jump into all of that, tell us a little bit about you. How did you get into the game of points and miles?
So I first heard about points and miles in a rather just random experience. I was staying at a hostel in China and happened to mention to some other person at the hostel, I've been wanting to come to China for a long time, but it's so far away and it costs so much to get here. And this other person just randomly turns around and says, "Not really. I flew here for free with points." And I was like, "Oh, you got to tell me more about this." I heard about points just from a random encounter at a hostel in China. I jumped in with both feet. I think a lot of people, when you first hear about points, like, oh, you're just going to open a lot of credit cards. It sounds suspicious. But for me, I think I picked up on how the general concept pretty quickly on like, how does this work? What are the positives, negatives? And just took off with it. And like next thing, my wife and I were opening credit cards and getting points because I think I was in the middle of a goal of trying to visit every country at that point, and I saw, oh, this is really going to help me get to all these places I'm trying to go to. So yeah, it was just fortuitous encounter at this hostel in Xi'an, China.
With every country that you've visited, which I think is all of them at this
Yep.
point, and all of the different products that you've flown, what would you say is on your top? You don't need to fly this, you don't need to experience this business class type of product.
Um, I've luckily avoided, I think, some of the worst ones because I see reviews, and if the headline's like Air India business class, skip it. Then I just take that as okay, that's a terrible way to start a review. It must be pretty bad. But if I'm looking to redeem my miles and it's telling me I might have a flight on some partner airline that I've never flown before, I'll pause and I'll go look for some pictures or some YouTube reviews and just see what it is if I don't know anyone who's flown that airline before. So I think I've avoided some of the worst ones in that way, but there are a couple that I think generally aren't that great. I think Aero Mexico business class is just very average. I recently flew both their old and their new business on the same day through a connecting itinerary. It was just very average Euro business class where it's just glorified economy seating with a blocked middle seat. It's just very average. I also think Royal Air Maroc has potential to be good, but isn't quite there yet. Is I've flown it several times and the best I would ever give it is a 5.5, but I've also had flights with them that I would give like a 1.5.
What happened on that 1.5-star flight?
Unexplained delays before we got started, broken in-flight entertainment system. They didn't have my special meal. I've been vegan for like 20 years. They didn't have my special meal even though I called and confirmed it like 3 times. There was a crying baby on the whole flight. It was just like everything that like if you would make a bingo card of like bad things on a flight, it had all of them. So it was just really terrible. But I've flown some others with them that were just like, would I go out of my way to fly that airline again? No, I've never had that experience. I've had some fair experiences with Royal Air Maroc. But then I think the most interesting, it has its haters. The most interesting business class that I've flown would be Zip Air, which is like a low cost airline out of Japan. My wife and I have flown them in economy and in business class. And the it's really not business class, and they do a good job of not marketing themselves as business class. They just call it full flat. You get a lie flat seat and that's it. It's still a low cost business model. No checked bags included, no priority boarding, no lounge unless you pay for it in Tokyo, no amenity kit unless you pay for it. But if you want just to lay flat across the Pacific, then you can get that at a decent price. But if you go onto it thinking it's gonna be like Air France business class, then you're gonna be pretty disappointed.
Yeah, with Zip Air, it's a pretty good cash rate. I don't think you can book this with points at all, but it's only about $1,200 or so per person one way from Los Angeles over to Japan. Is that about the same round trip?
And then round trip, you can find fares for like 2,100, 2,200 sometimes. And then what we did was we just like used our Capital One miles after the fact to just wipe the purchase off our credit card. Because yeah, there's no transfer partner. You're not gonna find it in like the Chase Travel portal or something like that. So it's an interesting model. I know people who hate it. I thought it was fair.
For everybody right now who's gasping of like, "You cashed out your Capital One miles instead of using a transfer partner." How do you go about thinking of those types of things where you're like, "It's better to use Capital One to wipe a $1,200 charge rather than to transfer X thousand points to a different airline?"
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to the value that you place on things, and I think there's a lot of one size fits all, and I think always been against a lot of this one size fits all type of thinking in points and miles because not everyone has the same travel style and not everyone has the same travel goals. My travel style and my travel goals have always been pretty different from a lot of people in this hobby. So I think when I first heard about points miles and learned about these transfer partners, and I remember hearing like never use your miles in the portal. You can get like 10 cents per point if you would do this and this, but I'm not trying to fly Lufthansa first class every day. Like if you are, congratulations. But that's not what I'm always trying to do. And sometimes just saving myself $1,100 by using miles, that works. It got me where I wanted to go. I was able to use my miles and it provided a redemption that I was happy with. Maybe somebody else would be like, but you could use your Capital One miles at 4.5 cents each if you would do this. Okay, but that's not where I was trying to go. I was trying to fly to Japan. And I think sometimes just like getting out of some of this group think and realizing that points and miles really only have value when you're using them. Sure, that guy over there is using them for this and they have that value in that situation, but what are they worth to you? Did you use your Delta miles to help you get somewhere last minute for somebody in your family's in the hospital? Sure. Was it a great redemption? For you, yeah. Cents per point, maybe not, but it was a great redemption.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to do that. I will live and die on the hill of using fixed value points.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get really obsessed with certain metrics because they saw somebody post about it on the internet, but like we tell everybody, use your points to do what you need to do. And if you need to cash out your points to buy groceries or something, if that's where you are right now, no shame. Do that. Get your groceries. It's going to be a lot more important for you to have groceries than a first class Lufthansa experience.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about Europe. What are some of the different business class products that maybe aren't worth it? If someone's, oh, should I fly this business class within Europe or to and from Europe? I know you mentioned the intra Europe flights a little bit. Talk about that.
Yeah, business class within Europe is similar to what you would think of with like first class if you're flying from, I don't know, Miami to Atlanta or from, I don't know, Chicago to Texas or something. And you show up at your flight for American Airlines and they say, now boarding first class. It's not really what you would think of first class with Etihad Airways, where you've got this like giant apartment in the sky. It's a bigger chair that reclines a little bit more than the cheaper seats. And business class in Europe tends to be something similar to this. They're like economy seats. You've got a little more leg room. Maybe they recline a little bit more. And the middle seat is blocked out. So no one's going to have a middle seat. It's like somebody can sit in A, somebody can sit in C, B is empty. So you've got more space. You're going to get on the plane sooner. If you paid for the flight, you're going to earn miles at a higher rate because it's premium. But beyond that, you're not getting a whole lot. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily worth cashing out your points for that type of flight. If you're connecting onwards, let's say you started in Germany and you're flying back to the US with Air France, maybe your flight from Germany to Paris is in this like European business class, then that's different because it might not really cost you any extra miles. But just in general, would I pay for a business class flight from London to Rome? No, I wouldn't because I don't think that it's worth this extra cost. It's just, I call it glorified economy. No one's in the middle seat, but beyond that, it's not that special. But I will create a caveat for Finnair. One of the best airplane services meals I've ever had was actually in Euro business on Finnair, connecting from France to Helsinki before flying back to the US. And they went all out. I was just expecting crackers. It's a very short flight, glorified economy, but it was actually awesome. I was really impressed because generally these short flights with like Euro business class, I don't think that they're that special. I wouldn't spend extra money or extra points for those.
How about the other Scandinavian airlines? Let's talk about Iceland Air, Norse, SAS. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, Iceland Air I've never flown, and I've never flown Norse, but I've read the reviews, I've seen videos and stuff, and I think that they're not lie flat business class. So if that's what you're looking for to get across the ocean, you'll probably be disappointed. Would I pay a bunch of extra money to fly in just with a little bit of extra recline on my seat? Probably not. It depends also on who you are and how easily you can sleep. Like I can sleep in anywhere at any time. My wife jokes that like I don't even hear the announcements on the plane because I can sit down, tilt my head to the side, and I'm out. For her, it's not the case. She needs to be in like a lie flat seat if she wants to be able to sleep on a plane. So I think part of that also factors in. And we're at the two ends of the extreme. And I don't think Iceland Air would make either of us happy. For my wife, or Norse or like Norse Atlantic, any of these types of models, because you're not going to get the lie flat, but you're going to pay more than economy. Well, I wouldn't be willing to pay more to go into the middle ground. and she wouldn't be willing to go into the middle ground because it's not gonna give her something she could really get decent sleep in. So I tend to avoid those because I don't think that they're worth the cost for who we are and our situation. There are people who buy them. I don't really know who they are because everyone I know is like, why would I pay extra to go into something that's not really like lying flat, but it costs more? It's a strange business model to me. SAS, I know people who like it, but I will say I've flown SAS business class twice, and both times it was terrible. The seats were installed incorrectly on both SAS class flights that I took, and they would not recline or lay flat. None of the seats in the cabin. That makes for a long flight when you're flying between Scandinavia and the US, especially when you coughed up the extra points or the extra cash, thinking that you're going to lay flat, you're going to get this great service, blah, blah, blah. And then you didn't get that. On one of the flights, my in flight entertainment screen was also broken along with my seat. I find their flight attendants are not that friendly in general. So it just makes for not a very good experience. But I know other people who've flown SAS and they thought that it was great, and I have seen pictures that prove the seats can go flat. Usually, they're supposed to, but I don't know what happened. Twice I wound up in SAS cabins where all the seats were just broken and couldn't go flat. So for me, I wouldn't fly them again just because I'm not willing to give them a third shot.
Man, that sucks, and it's not like it was just your seat happened to be broken, like, the entire cabin, so they can't even just move you to a different seat if there was one that was
Well,
open.
the first time that it happened, the cabin was, like, nearly empty because it was when travel had just started resuming after COVID. So, I would say it was like 1 out of 3 seats was full. So we went to other seats and we're trying to lay them down, trying to recline them, and it just wasn't possible. So it wasn't like it was just my seat. It was all of them. And I even wrote a review of this and people like accused me of being too dumb to know how to recline the seat. And come on, man. I've flown a few places before. I think I know how to recline the seat. And it wasn't just my seat. I tried the other seats. So I stand by the fact that I think I know what I'm talking about.
Are there any other products, like, within Europe or to and from Europe where you're just like, "I don't really think it's worth it to do the extra points or money for business class?"
Like angle flat for me just doesn't really seem worth it. Recliner business just doesn't really seem worth it because if I'm spending the extra for business class, what I'm looking for usually is like lying flat to try to get sleep through the night over the ocean. So these types of recliner seats, angle flat, it doesn't really offer what I'm looking for. So if in that respect, I don't think that it's worth the extra cost. I will be on a North Atlantic plane, or no, not North Atlantic, Norse plane recently, which Avianca took over. I will be on one of those recently or coming up soon. So I guess I'll find out. We got an aircraft swap for a flight coming up in November. It was so cheap that I'm just not going to try to fight about it or change anything, but I'm not excited about it. I'm gonna be on one of these angle flat Norse planes that's being used by Avianca now, and I guess we'll find out what the hype or lack of hype is all about.
For everybody who's listening and they're just like, I need to avoid this situation, how does one know if they're going to get the full lay flat, the weird angle flat, the glorified recliner? If they're just like, what's a 777? What's a 787? I'm not an av geek. What are any of these planes? How do you know what you're going to end up with?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. There's a couple of things that you can do. Number one, you can just I tend to use Google a lot and just Google business class on if you're looking at, I don't know, Air France, and it tells you you're gonna be on an Air France 787 from New York to Paris. Okay, Google Air France business class Boeing 787. Look at the pictures, watch some YouTube videos. If you're thinking about booking the ticket, you can also, at some point in the booking process, it'll give you an option to see like a seating chart. There's a site called Seat Guru, and that you can also see seat maps there. People can leave reviews like, don't choose seat 17J. It's right next to the bathroom. It's really loud. People are banging the door all the time. And you can get those kinds of things, see pictures of the seats, reviews. So I think just spending a couple minutes learning about, like, okay, what is this? I use Google for everything, and you can generally find someone who's been on that plane. Maybe if not on the same exact route that you flew, maybe not from, New York to Paris, but maybe they flew it from Paris to New York. Well, it's going to be basically the same thing. And then just seeing what that is. But then I think also it's worth paying attention to your flights once you've made those bookings. If you get an alert that says, "Oh, it's just we're letting you know that American Airlines flight 125, there's been a slight change." What you're probably looking at first is the times. Oh, well, it was gonna depart at 4:10, now it's gonna depart at 4:23. It doesn't really affect my day. But you should also look at some of those other details. Maybe before you were gonna be on this type of plane and now you're gonna be on that type of plane. In many situations, that probably won't make enough of a difference that you want to change your itinerary, but it could make a difference if you want to change your itinerary because maybe you booked a type of plane that was gonna have these lie flat seats. If the if your plane type changed, you should probably double check what type of seats you're going to be on now, because if it's going to move you onto a recliner type of seat instead, that's probably something where you could convince the airline, like, hey, this is not what I paid for. And you might be able to cancel without any kind of cancellation fees. I've had to do that in the past. So it's worth just looking up what type of flight is this gonna be on, like, what aircraft? And then probably someone has flown on that before, and you can find a review.
So, with all the different types of products we've discussed, where some of them you want to avoid because the product's just not good, like the Egypt Air things, a lot of the Air India stuff. You mentioned Royal Air Maroc, Aeromexico's okay. Avianca does not have great reviews. Sometimes you avoid them for that reason. What are some of the flights that you avoid upgrading to business class just because maybe it's an okay product, but it's just not worth the cost, where the value isn't there? What are some just ceilings for price outrageousness where you're like, we're not doing it?
My wife and I have a general kind of rule of when we think business class is worth it and when it's not worth it. Even if it was in a lie flat seats going from Europe back to the US, those are usually daytime flights. For us, we don't think that's generally worth it. I'm probably gonna try to stay awake on the flight because I wanna adjust to the time zone. If I'm not laying down and not trying to go to sleep and I'm gonna stay awake during the flight, I don't really need to be in business class. I can save my money and save my miles. So for us, daytime flying where we're planning on staying awake, it's not really worth it. I think also we try to not spend for business class if the flight's less than 5 hours, unless there's some kind of overarching, like, maybe it's 5 hours, but it's in the middle of the night. If you're taking off at midnight and you want to just sleep the whole time, might make an exception. But generally for us, if the flight's less than 5 hours, it's probably not worth it. It's more like usually 6 or 7, but five depending on time of day. I think also it depends on, I would never pay to upgrade into Euro business class or like recliner business class type seats in the US. I just don't think that it's worth it that much. If I want a seat in the exit row because I want the extra leg space, I'll just pay the 29 bucks to move into those extra legroom seats rather than paying, I don't know, 300 bucks to move into AA first class from here to Dallas. I think that I would get generally what I'm looking for if I want some extra space at my knees by just sitting in the exit row for 29 bucks. So I think for us, we tend to look at what am I going to get out of this if I pay to upgrade? And is that worth it? And a lot of times I think we have figured that out over the years that for us, if I'm going to stay awake on this flight, business class is almost never worth it.
I'm very much the opposite. I love daytime business class flights because I want all of the photos, and it's so difficult to get good photos in a cabin to show off on Instagram. Here's what the food's like, here's what the seat's like. It just really messes with all cameras if there's not good lighting, especially at night. But if you have sunlight flying in through the windows and you're like, oh, I can get all of the nice photos now, everything looks good on the seat. Let's open the window, take a photo of my meal.
For everybody who's a lot more obsessed with photos and posting all your stuff on Instagram, I am all about the daytime business class flights.
Yeah, and it all depends on, like I said, what's your travel style and what are your travel goals. If that's something that you need to accomplish for work reasons, or that's something that's because you have a big social media presence and you need those pictures, then that's part of what am I looking to get out of this flight. And again, that's just don't do just what other people doing. Just like you don't have to position halfway around the world just so you can try to get on this Eddie Hod first class deal if you're not planning to go to that part of the world. So I think for you that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned pricing as well. I like the 10K rule that we've discussed a few times on the channel, where for every hour of business class, I'm willing to pay up to 10,000 points. So if it's an 8-hour flight, I'll pay up to 80,000 points per person one way, not including layover times. And so I have taken some like really short business class flights where I think from Argentina to Brazil, that's what, 2.5 hours from Buenos Aires over to Sao Paulo. It was 20,000 Avianca life miles to fly Swiss business class on their Fifth Freedom flight, and Swiss business is very difficult to book to actual Switzerland, so I'm like, we'll experience this business class flight." So that's, like, my rule of thumb that I use for, is it worth it depending on how much time I'm gonna get in business class.
Did you know that's the only route that you can book Swiss first class on if you don't have status?
Yes, I tried so hard, but the availability just wasn't there, and we got on the plane, and I forgot how many first class seats they have,
I think it's
6
only
or
four. I
8?
I think it's 8. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of them were empty, but there weren't any upgrades available, and it took me forever to find business class availability, so I was like, "We're we get what we get, and we don't get upset." Are there any other types of rules that you have for yourself, you and your wife, where you're like, "Well, maybe it's worth it to pay business class under this threshold or under these circumstances, but otherwise, no."
I've never thought about the like what would I pay per hour? That might be an interesting thing to look at, like redemptions that I've made in the past of what I paid and when I decided not to, and see if there's a correlation in points per hour. But generally, I think we are the type of people who we want to travel a lot. And if I can save here, that's points I can use for another trip later on. People who can only take 1 or 2 trips a year might feel like splurging all the time on that trip is fine. You've got kids in school and you can really only travel like during breaks, spring break, summer break, whatever. So between now and next year, you've got a whole year to earn more points because you're really only traveling 1 or 2 times. Sure, then you might think the splurges are worth it. But for me, I tend to be more conservative because that's points I could use for something else later in the year. Yeah, if it was up to me, I would fly in economy a lot more, but my wife just she can't fall asleep as easily as I can. That's something that we take into consideration because otherwise she's just gonna be like wrecked for the first 2 days trying to adjust to the time zone and she didn't get any sleep or whatever. So I think it works out better if we need to sleep, we'll just fly in a lie flat seat.
My husband and also me are probably on the opposite end where we're like, all right, if we're crossing an ocean, it's got to be in business class at this point. If that means we're only taking 3 trips per year instead of 4, that's fine. We don't need to be constantly traveling because, yeah, at this point, we're like, I don't really want to haul myself to the airport and go somewhere. If it's just going to be an economy, I'd rather just save up the points and take fewer but nicer trips. And I know some people are on the opposite end of that spectrum, and that's totally fine because everybody has their own travel style. What do you think is the most expensive business class flight where you're like, "It was worth it, but oh my god, it took so many points or took so much money, but it was worth it."
It's probably like 90,000 AA miles home from Maldives was probably that was I think the most miles I've ever spent on a trip because I've only ever flown first class once. I didn't think that it was great and probably won't fly first class again anytime soon. And that was using Virgin points for A and A first class before the devaluation. So it was less than my Q suites home from I paid 90,000 because we were living in Brazil at the time, so we flew Q suites from Maldives to Doha to Sao Paulo.
I think I forked over like 160,000 points per person for Cathay Pacific first class, I haven't taken this flight yet. I really hope it's worth it because that was a lot of points that we moved over to
It's a
Cathay
lot.
Pacific for first class. Yeah, it's a
And
lot.
you were probably so nervous while you were waiting for those points to transfer.
Well, the thing was, I already had it booked in business class like months ahead of time. And then I saw that, oh, there's some first class availability and it happened to line up with the dates. So I'm like, all right, I'll cancel my business class flight, rebook it into first.
I lied. I booked 2 round the world trips before. Those were my most expensive redemptions.
How much were they?
170 Cathay and 185 Cathay. Both times I did them with Cathay Pacific One World.
The around the world trips tend to be worth it though, because you get so many flights out of it.
They became a necessity because once I got close to my goal of visiting every country, I realized that I had these like countries that were very like isolated, and it was not as simple as, well, I need to go to France and Germany and those are next to each other. No, I needed to go to like countries that weren't really next to each other at all. So I booked round the world because I knew it was going to be the simplest way to declutter this situation and I could do 2 round the world trips. But yeah, those were my most expensive redemptions because they were both like over 150,000 miles each. But if I had booked the flights kind of in pieces, or if I had gone here and then come home and then gone here and then come home, I would have spent much more in the long run.
What was the route that you took for the around the world?
So the first one was I flew from California through Japan to South Korea. Then I flew from South Korea to Vietnam through Hong Kong. Then I flew from Vietnam to Iran with Qatar. Then I flew from Iran to Jordan and then purchased the remaining piece from there to Israel as a separate ticket back to Jordan and then flew from there home. Then the other one, US to Bolivia through, I booked this one with ANA and I went US to Bolivia to Istanbul and then purchased a ticket separately from Istanbul over to Turkmenistan and back. And then I went from there to into the Pacific, bought a separate leg with cash into Nauru, and then flew. And then from there onwards to Fiji Airways, because Nauru's national airline is the only airline that can enter or leave the island. And then from Fiji Airways, connected back home to California.
Yeah, those around the world trips can be really painful to set up, but you can get so much value out of them. So that's amazing. As we wrap up here and we think through all the different ways to maximize your points and what might be worth it, what might not be worth it, what would you say is your number one tip for listeners today who are looking to level up their points game?
Don't do what you think everyone else is doing. Whether that's redeeming your points in a certain way, whether that's thinking you have to fly on a certain airline or have to fly to a certain place or you have to stay at a certain hotel. Like, think about your travel goals and your travel style, and then figure out how points and miles can help you do the things that you want to do. So, if you want to use your points to help you get to like Vietnam and then stay at a bunch of backpacker hostels in Southeast Asia, awesome. Go do that. You don't have to stay at the Park Hyatt. If you want to use points and miles to stay at luxury places, then you can do that too. But I think the biggest thing is figuring out your travel goals and then doing those, even if you feel like everyone else is doing something different.
Great advice. And speaking of great advice, can you give a shout out to somebody else on the internet who you would recommend listeners follow for even more points and miles tips?
I'll recommend 2 people because they both give solid advice that I know nothing about. And those 2 people would be Dia Adams at Fortune Recommends and Tony Perkins Southam, who's at Forbes Advisor. Both of them have multiple children and they figure out how to do this points and miles stuff with like half of a football team trying to get from here to Europe or to South America. My wife and I don't have any kids. It's very simple sometimes to find seats for 2 people. I have no idea how they figure out how to get hotel rooms and flights and stuff for like 5, 6 people. So if you've got a family and you're looking to figure out how to use points and miles for a family, those are 2 people that you should be following. They have really good advice on how to do award travel with a big family.
Fantastic. And where can we find you on the internet?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter, X at Ryan Smith Travel. And then also, my wife and I just recently started an Instagram. I know we're late to the game on this, but you can follow us. It's Aventura Now, Aventura Now, and learn about finding vegan food where we go, hotel reviews, flight reviews, what to do in these weird places that we're going.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Ryan, so much for joining us on the show today. It has been a pleasure, and I'm sure everybody will find this episode very valuable so that they can avoid certain travel experiences that people don't want to have.